On a crisp December morning, Halifax City was buzzing with life. Shops were opening up to begin the workday ahead, children were hurrying to finish their chores before heading off to school, and everyone else likewise was bustling about to begin their day. The morning was just like any other, giving no indication of the disaster that was quickly drawing near. The port city of Halifax, situated on the Canadian East Coast, was one of the closest major ports to Europe and North America. Thus, throughout World War I, ships coming in and out of the harbor often contained battle supplies in which were to be delivered to France and Belgium. Through the Narrows, the upper half of the Halifax harbor was connected to Bedford Basin. The strait was approximately half a kilometer wide, requiring ships to strictly remain in their designated lane as they passed through. The ships intending to enter the harbor were instructed to sail along the east side of the waters, while exiting ships were on the west. Prior to the day of the catastrophe, on December the 5th, 1917, the Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship, arrived in Halifax. However, anti-submarine nets against the Germans were strung across the Halifax harbor for the night, forcing the Mont Blanc to remain in the basin until morning. The Mont Blanc had been given strict orders from the French government to transport highly explosive materials from New York City through Halifax to Bordeaux, France. The ship held nearly 3,000 tons of explosives. This included 2,366 tons of picric acid, 256 tons of TNT, 246 tons of benzene, and 62 tons of gun cotton. Now, usually a red flag would be attached to these kinds of ships and warning to others of the dangerous cargo. However, during this time, the risk was high that enemy ships would spot the flag and take advantage of the opportunity. If the red flag caught the eye of Central Power seamen, things could end disastrously. Therefore, regulations had now been changed, and the Mont Blanc gave no indication to others of the explosives on board. That same evening, the SS Immu, a Norwegian cargo ship, had finally received its long-awaited fuel supplies in the Bedford Basin. The ship had previously sailed from the Netherlands and was now on its way to New York, carrying relief supplies intended for Belgium. It put its journey on pause December 3rd as it arrived in the basin to undergo a required neutral inspection. Its travels were delayed 2 days as the ship was then forced to await fuel. Finally, on the 5th, its coal load was delivered and the SS Immu would be in a rush to arrive at the Halifax harbor the following morning. December the 6th had now arrived, and at 7:30 a.m. both ships were off, the Mont Blanc now exiting the harbor and the SS Immu sailing on the east side of the Narrows on its way to enter. Along the way, the SS Immu came across the SS Clara, an American steamer, which was mistakenly sailing on the wrong side of the harbor. To avoid a collision with the oncoming ship, the SS Immu veered off and found itself in the wrong lane of the harbor. It was now 8:20 in the morning, and the ship would find itself facing the Mont Blanc in less than half an hour. Before it had a chance to correct its path, the Stella Maris, a tugboat, had made the same mistake as the SS Clara. The Immu again spotted the oncoming tugboat and was now forced even further to the wrong side of the waters. Entering the narrowest part of the harbor at 8:30 a.m., the ship was now directly in the path of the lethal Mont Blanc. Less than 20 minutes had now passed, and the two ships were in sight of one another. With the cargo ship in close view, the Mont Blanc sounded its whistle, instructing the SS Immu to return to its original path. However, the Immu responded with its whistle, expressing to the Mont Blanc that it was remaining in its present course. The disaster was dangerously nearing. Now just seconds away, and the Mont Blanc frantically decided to steer to its left, heading in the direction of the Halifax port. At that same moment, the Immu veered sharply to its right, crashing directly into the upper half of the Mont Blanc. Within an instant, fires sprouted from the hit, spreading rapidly along the deck of the Mont Blanc, lit by the barrels of benzene on board. Knowing nothing could be done now, the ship's crew fled on emergency boats, trying desperately to get as far away from the death sentence as possible. The Mont Blanc, raging with fire, was now beginning to slowly drift towards the helpless Halifax city. Oblivious to what was on board, a boat of men then sailed to the Mont Blanc in attempts to put out the fire. In addition, firemen were also called for and rushed to the scene. Crowds gathered at the shores to watch the spectacle, unaware that they should instead be running for their lives. The blustering ship was about to blow. At 9:04 a.m., the Mont Blanc had reached the land, and in a single second, the ship completely burst. This was the most massive man-made explosion at that time in history. Areas within an 800-meter radius of the explosion were utterly demolished. Pieces of the city skyrocketed into the air, and the entire premises was left in ruins. Trees were completely snapped in the wave of the explosion. Pieces of the Mont Blanc blew kilometers away, and nearby ships, including the SS Imu, were blown ashore by the massive tidal wave. Out of the 1,900 people who died from the explosion, 1,600 were killed immediately, and 9,000 others suffered severe injuries. 1,630 homes were blown to pieces, and another 12,000 were damaged, leaving 6,000 people homeless on the streets and 25,000 others without a secure place of shelter. The Halifax-Richmond district was left with nothing but the crumbled remains of the once thriving city. Damage even went as far as Dartmouth on the other side of the harbor. There, the Miquam First Nations settlement, which had existed in the Turtle Grove area since the 18th century, was completely wiped out. From the ruined premises, those who survived the blast emerged from the debris and did what they could to uncover other fellow victims. Surviving policemen, firefighters, and those of the military began to gather, and anyone with a functioning vehicle was instructed to collect the injured. The hospitals were then overwhelmed with patients in need of immediate medical attention. On that single day, the Camp Hill Military Hospital received 1,400 injured people. Doctors, nurses, and essentially anyone with the slightest amount of medical experience was required to undergo perhaps one of the most demanding and traumatizing times of their lives, as people left and right displayed the most gory and terrible injuries. A great deal of injuries were a result of broken glass piercing through the flesh and robbing people of their sight. For while the catastrophe was nearing and the Mont Blanc was still in flames, those who were not gathered watching the scene at the shores were inside buildings behind windows. Thousands stood in front of these panes of glass, intensely watching what was going on down in the harbor. When the cargo ship blew, glass not only ripped through the body, but also soared into the eyes of those standing in the way of the flying blades. Windows were shattered in buildings from as far as 80 kilometers away. Hundreds permanently lost their eyesight that morning, as thousands of other eye injuries were painfully inflicted. In all this chaos, the assumption was made that the explosion was a result of a bomb dropped by the Germans, and rumors rapidly spread throughout the wrecked city that another explosion was on its way. Thus, troops stood on guard, prepared for another attack. After around an hour, however, the cause of the explosion was identified, and the troops left their posts to assist in the rescue mission. From all across Halifax, firefighters rushed to the scene. From the West Street Station 2 of the Halifax Fire Department, Canada's first fire truck, named the Patricia, was sent. Hundreds of other firemen arrived on trains dispatched from as far as Amherst, Nova Scotia, and Moncton, New Brunswick, while other rescue trains arrived after racing from across Atlantic Canada and northeastern U.S. The trains delivered relief supplies as well as loaded up as many wounded victims from the blast as possible and transported them to hospitals in Truro. Rescue parties and medical aid was also sent from the waters. Several of the nearby Royal Navy cruisers like the HMS Highflyer and the HMS Knight Templar sent boats to assist in the rescue. The boats arrived at the shores and boarded the wounded, some serving as hospital ships equipped with doctors and medical personnel. Aid was also delivered from places as far away as China and New Zealand, in which each country donated money in effort of the rehabilitation of Halifax. Contributing to the cost of the damage that was inflicted, Canada also gave $18 million, Britain $5 million, and the Massachusetts state gave $750,000 worth in money, supplies, and volunteers to help in the city's reconstruction. The overwhelming amount of destruction and devastation, however, at first had people bewildered on where to begin in the city's restoration. The first well-known priority, however, was the fact that temporary support and relief needed to be provided for the victims of the Halifax explosion. On January 22, 1918, a little over a month since the occurrence of the explosion, the Halifax Relief Commission was established. This commission provided pensions, claims to loss of property, and necessary shelter for those who were left in desperate need. Temporary apartment buildings were then constructed in the style of tenement buildings, which could be put up and torn down quickly. These apartment buildings would serve as an improvise for the lack of housing until new homes were again available. To accomplish this task, 2,200 workers boarded at the exhibition grounds toiled hard with another 1,500 workers sent by local construction companies. Together, these men had approximately one apartment building completed every hour, and within the 7 weeks following the day of the explosion, 3,000 houses were again standing erect and renewed. Slowly but surely, Halifax was again put back on its feet. December 6, 2017 marked the 100-year anniversary of the Great Halifax Explosion, and today the city again is flooded with life as cars pass by through the busy streets and buildings tower tall above the 430,000 people living in the once destroyed city. To this day, the memorials and graves of those killed in the explosion still stand and represent the lives lost in the terrible blast that whole century ago, reminding us that despite the battlefronts in Europe during World War I being thousands of kilometers away, lives here in our own country were still lost, injuries were still suffered, and destruction still inflicted. Though the war fronts were a whole ocean away, those killed and wounded in the Halifax explosion were still casualties of the war.